My name's Quick Pick Nick, and using millions of simulations, here's your locks and lotteries for Week 7 of the NFL on both FanDuel and DraftKings this Sunday, October 24th. Before we get started, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the future full slates, single-game lineups on Monday or Thursday Night Football, and NBA slates. There will be full lineups for both FanDuel and DraftKings at the end of this video, and for reference, a lock in this video means that the player has a high confidence interval to exceed his price point projection, whereas a lottery means the confidence interval is slightly lower, but still that player is expected to exceed his price point projection given his cost. Starting at quarterback, our lock for this week is someone who has been able to avoid his second-year slump in Joe Burrow, facing a Baltimore defense allowing the 8th most passing yards per game to opponents. Burrow has scored more than 20 fantasy points in each of his past 3 contests, and this Ravens secondary should prove no more difficult than any of those 3 that Burrow has faced thus far. If you don't want to back the Bengals today, though, one lottery quarterback you might want to consider is Matt Ryan, who's a bit more expensive on FanDuel but cheaper on DraftKings, where I would recommend taking a good look at Ryan for this slate. Miami's defense is the 4th worst with respect to allowed passing yards per game, and with Calvin Ridley returning to the Falcons lineup alongside Kyle Pitts, Ryan should be able to score massive points against the Dolphins secondary. At running back, the one player I would consider a lock in this slate is Darryl Patterson, simply because he is one of the most versatile players available. On FanDuel, you can take Patterson as either a running back or receiver, so I would recommend taking Patterson as a receiver since there are more valuable picks to take at running back on FanDuel given their half PPR scoring compared to DraftKings full PPR scoring. But Patterson counts as only a running back on DraftKings anyway, so you should definitely find him in your lineup on that platform either way. Patterson has had his best season yet this year with 18 FanDuel fantasy points per game and even more on DraftKings, and with that vulnerable Miami defense I mentioned earlier, the amount of screen passes, short-range routes, and rushing plays Patterson is going to receive will more than justify his cost on either platform. In terms of lotteries, there are a few running backs I should mention that were found in some of my top-ranked simulated lineups. Those running backs included Derrick Henry, who was obviously extremely expensive but still one of the best players in the NFL, facing one of the worst offenses in the NFL. So do your best to make room in the budget for the king if possible. Damien Harris facing a bottom 10 defense with respect to allowed rushing yards to opponents against the New York Jets and a Patriots offense that heavily favors the run game, and James Conner facing a Houston defense that has allowed not only the 2nd most rushing yards per game, but also the most rushing touchdowns allowed per game. At wide receiver, the best lock my model found is Chris Godwin, facing a potential leading opportunity in Tampa Bay's offense with Antonio Brown sidelined this week. Godwin is cheaper than Mike Evans on both platforms, even though their difference in fantasy output has been somewhat negligible. So Godwin should be able to justify his cost with his fantasy output this week against Chicago. Since there are so many other lottery receivers with a great amount of options in this slate, I'll try to get through as many as possible without wasting anybody's time. The first lotteries in my simulations are once again one of the primary Rams receivers. Cooper Kupp is obviously much more expensive than Robert Woods, but both of their costs seems to be lower than their projection would imply given their fantasy potential. Cooper Kupp has been one of the best fantasy receivers this year and faces the last completely defeated team in the NFL, signaling only good vibes for the top pick, and the same goes for Robert Woods, with Detroit ranking in the bottom half of the league in allowed receiving yards. Another lottery who still hasn't gotten the respect he deserves, especially on DraftKings, is Jamar Chase, ranking 4th in both receiving yards and touchdowns this season among receivers, facing that porous Baltimore defense I mentioned earlier with my Joe Burrow pick. One of the Bears receivers might also be a good pick in this case, namely Allen Robinson, even though he has struggled so far this season, since he will face Tampa Bay's defense that has allowed the 6th most receiving yards to opponents. I know Robinson has been disappointing to most fantasy managers this season, but this matchup against the Buccaneers might be Robinson's breakout game. Also, Detroit receivers might not be bad options either, including TJ Hockenson, since the Rams defense has not been performing as expected, ranking in the bottom 10 in allowed receiving yards per game. Miami receivers too also seem like valuable picks, with Tua Tagovailoa coming back from injury against Atlanta. Finally, he's the most expensive for a reason. Davante Adams is actually a good pick even with his colossal price tag, as he will face a Washington defense that ranks absolutely last in the NFL with respect to passing yards per game. Moving towards the tight end position, there are a couple of picks my model found viable for this slate. The 2 players my model was drawn to are Kyle Pitts, especially on FanDuel where he's relatively cheaper, facing that weak Miami defense that Matt Ryan will hopefully be able to take advantage of, and Hunter Henry, going up against a Jets defense that honestly might never be good again given that depressing decade we've had so far from the Jets. At flex, I'd recommend filling in the position with someone I've mentioned earlier in this video or someone else who might fit the budget better. Finally, the defense should be the cheapest possible option without picking a blowout. In this case, on FanDuel, you should aim for the Titans, Jets, and Chiefs, and on DraftKings, you should try to get the Titans, Eagles, and Jets. In any case, here are the full lineups for this slate on both FanDuel and DraftKings. You'll notice that the DraftKings lineups includes very solid receivers and running backs, somewhat sacrificing on the flex position, but still providing a good option with potential to score high points there, while the FanDuel lineup is more balanced, including opportunities for every player to produce big fantasy outputs. I think any player found in either of these lineups are viable, and that we'll be able to take at least a few bucks from FanDuel and DraftKings using these players. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss another full slate lineup or any future single game lineups, including tomorrow morning for Monday Night Football. Thanks for watching.